remember, Hebrews is written to Jewish believers in Messiah. It's written before 70 AD, but really before the fall of the temple. It's when that temple was a reality, and the believing Jewish people, they never really left Judaism, but they were still participating in the life and the function of the temple, and they were getting kicked out because they believed in Yeshua. And there was that struggle, that temptation of, is it worth it? Do I go back? Do I give up faith in Yeshua in order to gain access back to the things going on in the temple? And so one of the more important verses in all of this is Hebrews 2:1. He says, "For this reason it is necessary for us to pay especially close attention to what we have heard, so that we don't drift away." We don't lose what we have gained in coming to Messiah. So this letter is exhorting believers to hold firm and to heed what they've been taught and not waver. So this realization of this reality, the reality is that the life of Yeshua is not always going to be an easy one. Walking in His ways, doing what He has called us to do is not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be well received. It's not always going to be well liked. And it may bring trouble. In this world you will have trouble. They will hate us oftentimes because of our relationship with Him. And life is going to be full of pressures. It's going to be full of people that are going to try to pull you down. It's going to try to take you in the wrong direction and off the path of God. And so this is a time of testing for believers. And the true metal of our faith is revealed essentially every day. The impurities of our faith are going to be exposed with the intent that God wants to remove those things. He wants to remove those impurities from our lives. And so it's this time of testing. And as long as it is called today, as long as we are waiting for the day that is to come, that is the day of the Lord, we've got to decide how we will respond to the things that are going on. How will we respond to the Father and His commands? Are we going to hold to them or not? And so we were looking at Hebrews chapter 3 last week, and we read a couple of these. It says, "Therefore, just as the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. There your fathers put me to the test, though they saw my works for 40 years. It says, "Therefore I was provoked by this generation, and I said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." That's the declaration. That's the proclamation. It says, "Take care, brothers and sisters, that none of you has an evil heart of unbelief that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another day by day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partners of Messiah if we hold our original conviction firm to the end." Y'all remember talking about this last week, right? What's one of the most important words in this verse? If. It's this one. The if. Not very big, but it's very important. So, what we're looking at in this, and what he's referring to in all of this, is that even when you see a blatant display of God's power and glory, even if you were given something like that in your life, that is no guarantee that our hearts are going to respond in faith and not in rebellion. You hear so many people that say, well, if God would just show Himself, if He would just reveal Himself or do something powerful, then I would believe in Him. No, that's not necessarily true. People have seen Him and see Him do great things, and they still don't. And they won't because they don't really want to. Sin hardens our heart. A hard heart rebels against the command of God and the direction and the life of God. But see, we get to demonstrate our partnership, partners of Messiah. We demonstrate our partnership with Messiah by holding to our conviction, by standing firm in the face of difficulty and trial. He is asking us to partner with him in these things. And there is no better person in the world or in the universe to partner with than the Messiah. Right? Wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, wouldn't that be better? I mean, his work will be the most satisfying. His work will be the most rewarding. It may not always be the most paying. Right? But is that really what matters? Think about it like this. If Bill Gates or Elon Musk or somebody like that comes walking in the door, or the President of the United States comes walking in here and makes us an offer, they could offer quite a lot, couldn't they? But if they offer us maybe a lucrative and powerful partnership, but as part of the terms of accepting that deal, requires that you violate your walk with Messiah, which one do you want to partner with? Who do you want to keep walking with? Obviously, that needs to be the Messiah. But so many will look at the money, so many will look at the power, they'll look at the rewards that this world has to offer, and they'll think that those things are more valuable than what Messiah has to offer. They will look at what they can see rather than the promise that they may not be able to see. This world and its rewards feel and it seems more real than what cannot yet be seen. And that's the rub against Yeshua in general. The scriptures claim that he is crowned with glory and honor and that the world is subjected to him. But it also says back in chapter 2, it says, you put all things in subjection underneath his feet. For when he put all things in subjection to him, he left nothing outside of his control. But for now, we do not yet see all things subjected to him. That's today. That's not that day. As long as it is called today, for now, we do not yet see all things subject to him. But what are we called to do? Do we go with what we see? Do we go with our eyes? Or do we go with the promise? Do we believe the move of God that we have seen or heard about, or with the day-to-day reality? Do we walk his path or do we rebel? And what exactly are we rebelling against? In a lot of ways, we're rebelling against the rest that he has promised. As long as it is called today, we have a choice whether we're going to rebel or obey. As it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion. So the author, Hebrews author, is saying this to believers in Yeshua, that we have a choice to make as well. That old example that he gives is for our current situation. And so if you ever wonder how people who lived through some of the things that they saw, some of the most amazing things, the amazing miracles in the scriptures, and then turn around and do and say the things that they did, realize that we can just as easily do the same thing. We are not any different than they are. There's nothing out of the ordinary or all that different from our generation, from that generation to this one. And considering all that they had seen and all that you and I maybe have seen. Hebrews 3:16 says, "Now which ones heard and rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt with Moses, and with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness?" So that generation heard and saw great things, and still their heart was hardened, and their hearts rebelled. That same generation that saw all those things, all those great things, also didn't make it. They did not make it into the promised land. They didn't enter the rest that they had been looking forward to, because they had the heart of rebellion in spite of what they had seen God do. And he says, and to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? Was it not to those who were disobedient? And so we see that they were not able to enter in because of this lack of trust. The generation that was considering, what was their complaint? What were they talking about doing when they were griping against Moses? Wouldn't it be better if we just went back to Egypt? That's what they were debating. That's what they were contemplating. What are the believers of Hebrews debating and considering? Maybe I should give up Yeshua and just go back to the life I knew before. They were considering whether to go back and get in good graces with the temple by renouncing Yeshua. That generation could make exactly the same mistake and the same mistake that this generation made. That they were coming out of Egypt. And they should not be willing to ignore the lesson of history. We see Paul talk about something like that in 1 Corinthians. He says, these things happened to them as an example, and it was written down as a warning to us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. In other words, you need to look at it and examine and see these lessons, see these things, that these mistakes that they made, so you don't do the same thing that they did. You don't make the same mistakes that they made. The Israelites, they had been redeemed from slavery. They had seen these great and wonders and moves of God, and they weren't just stories that somebody else told them. They witnessed them, they experienced them, but they did not fully enjoy or experience all that God had for them in those moments, in that generation, in those days, because they were rebelling against Him. This entire generation that had just seen all these things, they had to die off before their children could move forward into the promise. That's kind of a scary thought. These hard hearts, these disobedient ones, the rebellion had caused this delay of the rest that was promised. And it's like they didn't really believe what they had seen. See, the hope what we hope for is that our faith will one day become sight. Right? That's what we hope for, that our faith becomes sight. But this proves that sight does not necessarily become faith. Seeing is not necessarily and not always believing. So that's one of the amazing statements of Yeshua. He says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. So are we still rebelling in spite of all that we have seen and heard? Are we rebelling in spite of all the things that He has shown us? Are we rebelling and hardening our heart to God and His ways? And so, are we experiencing things? Are we experiencing that delay? Are we experiencing and not entering His rest, not fully enjoying the benefits of our walk and our relationship with Him? And it's that kind of relationship and that benefit that's not just off in the future on that day, but it's also the benefits that are here for today. Not just in the future, but the rest that is available now. And are we not experiencing all of that because we don't really trust Him the way we think? See, what would y'all say is the opposite of rebellion? Rebellion, the opposite of that is obedience, trust, faith, submission, right? Those are all opposites of what rebellion is. And so what are we really rebelling against? We're really rebelling against Him. We're really rebelling against God and His ways. Just like when the people were asking for a king, it wasn't really that they were upset with the prophet. They were rejecting God as king. And how are we not trusting? Are we not trusting in just the big things? Or sometimes are we not trusting even in the small things? And does that matter? Well, Yeshua talked about if you're faithful in the big things, then you get to do big things. What does he say? If you're faithful in the little things, then it makes you eligible, I guess to say, to do greater things. So we are not trusting, in the little things many times. This quote, they shall not enter my rest, comes from Psalm 95. It's a little more specific as to where and when this lack of trust was demonstrated. And the Jewish audience that this was written to would know exactly, what the circumstances were. Psalm 95 says this. He says, "For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice," sounds familiar, "do not harden your heart as at Meribah, as in the days of Massah in the wilderness. When your fathers tested me, they challenged me, even though they had seen my work." So he's referring to a specific event in history. Are we still rebelling in spite of all that we have seen and heard? Meribah is translated as complained. And Massah is translated as tested. Okay? Those are what those two words mean. It is referring to what happened back in Exodus chapter 17, where the people were in need of water because the water they found after the crossing of the Red Sea, in fact, right after the crossing of the Red Sea, the water source that they came to was bitter. And so it says, "Behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock in Horeb." They went complaining to Moses. "You are to strike the rock, and water will come out of it so that the people can drink." Then Moses did just so in the eyes of the elders of Israel. And the name of the place was called Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of Bnei Israel and because they tested Adonai, saying, "Is Adonai among us or not?" I mean, isn't that a ridiculous question, you'd think? Is Adonai among them or not? And what had they just done? They said that after seeing the death of the firstborn, after seeing the pillar of fire, after passing through the Red Sea and the death of Pharaoh's army. This is the first thing that happens after all of that. And gee, I don't know if God's really with us or not. I mean, it's not like he's done anything for us before. But it's like, really, they didn't believe that he could keep doing it. Like he could sustain and preserve them. Oh, sure, yeah, God, you can do the big things. You can part the Red Sea. You can do all of those things. You can fight the big battles. But really, are you that interested in provide in the day-to-day life? The mundane little things? Because, I mean, water to drink in the desert is a big deal. And you need it. But it's a relatively small matter compared to things that he'd already been doing. But it's also the first thing that happens in a long line of evidence about the kind of faith that they had. This moment didn't get the pronouncement from God. It didn't get the judgment from God about, well, because you complained about the water, you're not going to be able to enter into the rest. You're not going to be able to go into the promised land. That was the aftermath of the 12 spies. Years later, in that evil report. But the spirit in both moments is the same. A spirit of fear, a lack of trust, and unbelief, because they had no faith in the small matters of the water. They had no faith for the larger matter of the land when they went out to look at it. They didn't believe him for this, for the water. And so when he said, go and look in the land and see what kind of place is in there, can you go and take it? They said, we don't think he can do that either. Despite all that they had seen. And so they came out of Egypt driven by fear more than faith, a lot of times. They came out with Moses, but didn't really have the faith of Moses. They were part of the group, but didn't really know or believe or trust in God. And interestingly enough, about this moment in Exodus 17, it's the incidents in which the living water from the rock occurred. Right? The rock, tradition says, did what as they traveled? Tradition talks about the rock going with them and traveling with them, so they had water where they went on all of their journeys. And this rock is a picture of the provision and presence of who? Of Messiah. And that was a belief and an understanding of the day. Paul even refers to it in 1 Corinthians 10. For I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, referring to this same event, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were all immersed into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, that's talking about the manna, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Messiah. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, for they were struck down in the desert. Now these things happened as examples for us. There's that concept again. So we wouldn't crave evil things just as they did. So the rock that followed them, the rock is a picture of an understanding of Messiah. But how did they get this rock? How did the Israelites get the rock? Why did God provide it for them? You wonder, well, if they hadn't complained, would they have got the rock? I don't know how that works, because Moses had to go up there and strike it, and God, he hadn't told them anything about that yet. But it was because of their unbelief and their rejection that the rock was shown to them. Because of their unbelief and rejection, the people, the Israelites, even the mixed multitude, were provided with water. And Messiah, the rock, was provided because of their lack of trust. It wasn't the last time that this lack of trust turned into an actual benefit. It was by the rejection of Yeshua in Jerusalem. What happened to Messiah? Messiah was struck and crucified. And because of him being struck and crucified, living water mixed with blood, was poured out. And the benefit was salvation. Right? And what the readers needed to understand was that if the rock was provided because of unbelief and a lack of trust, and that rock, the Messiah, traveled with Israel everywhere they went in the desert, they need to understand that if they have received the rock, if they have received Messiah, then Messiah is going to be with them everywhere they go. He will be with them even if they are driven out of the temple as Israel was driven out of Egypt. Messiah will travel with them. And they are not lost or abandoned, and they still have access to the living water. And what they are seeing in their day, this unbelief and lack of trust in Messiah, the leadership or the Jewish people rejecting faith in Messiah, that can also have an unexpected benefit, because while many Jews did believe, the continued rejection and rebellion of many provided this other benefit to the remaining mixed multitude of the world. Right? Isn't that how Paul talks about it? They did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Oh, may never be. But by their false steps, salvation, by their grumbling and complaining, you could say, this salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. Now, if their transgression leads to riches for the world, and their lost riches for the Gentiles, then how much more their fullness? So somehow, God turned in this moment of lack of trust and unbelief into a benefit. And yes, God does not like unbelief. He does not like a lack of trust, but is he able to work out all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose? Can he do things in spite of us? Yes, he can. The ones that kick the readers out of the temple are really also the ones who are not drinking from the rock. They're not enjoying the benefit of God's provision. And unless things change, not for the readers of Hebrews, but unless things change for the ones that kicked them out of the temple, they will not be entering into the rest and promise of God because of their unbelief, because of their lack of trust in the rock, Messiah Yeshua. So the promise and its fulfillment, the promise and the determination of who enters that rest. Who gets to determine who enters the rest? Is it the high priest in the temple and the ones that kicked them out? No. It's not really up to them. It's up to God. It's based on faith and trust in the one that has been revealed. It's been the one that is the rock that he has sent. But I need to also point out again, we are not immune to this choice and this testing. They were seeing it all play out. They were seeing it play out before their eyes. But we don't want to miss the significance of the time and the era in which they lived. They didn't want to miss that time and that era. We don't want to miss the time and era in which we live. He says, let us fear then, in Hebrews chapter 4. Let us fear. Talking again to those who believe. Though a promise of entering his rest is left open, some of you would seem to have fallen short. For we also have had good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the word they heard did not help them, because they were not unified with those who listened in faith. Notice something interesting here. We've talked about this a little bit. The generation that experienced the Exodus heard the good news. They heard the gospel proclaimed to them, right? We've had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. He's talking about that previous generation. This good news was obviously for the Exodus. It wasn't the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua. That was still in the future. But the good news is of the arrival of the kingdom of God and his deliverance to enter into it. Right? That's even what Paul talks about in Colossians 1. He rescued us from the domain of darkness and he brought us into the kingdom of the Son whom he loves. In him we have redemption, the release of sins. We have had the good news of deliverance and redemption proclaimed to us. Just as the generation that was reading the book of Hebrews for the first time, just as the generation of the Exodus had had it proclaimed to them. They were being rescued. This was happening to them, literally. And if we don't respond in faith, if we don't respond in obedience, then it will be of no help to us. If we reject and renounce what we have learned, we will be no different than the generation that came out of Egypt and immediately started complaining. When we rebel, when we leave, when we quit or return and don't hold firm, what are we really rejecting? Again, what are we rejecting? We are rejecting his provision and his promise. We are rejecting his rest. That's what Hebrews 4:3 talks about. For we who have trusted, not like that generation that complained, we who have trusted are entering into that rest. We are entering into that rest. We haven't fully entered, but we are entering. It's an ongoing thing. It is just as God has said, so in my wrath I swore they shall never enter my rest, even though his works were finished since the foundation of the world. So the generation reading Hebrews is in the same boat as those coming out of Egypt. And we are in the same boat as the generation of Hebrews. We're in a similar today with all that God is doing, and we don't want to reject His rest, because His rest signifies something important. God's rest is this indication of this symbol, it's a description of God's kingdom, which is His rule and His reign on earth. That rule and that reign doesn't have to wait until that day, the Lord's day, but it begins in the life of the believers, even so long as it's called today. We get this foretaste of it. And what is the indication that you wish to be governed by the rule and reign of God? What's one of the most common reminders that we have, that we want to demonstrate, that we want to live in God's kingdom? It's actually this. It's the Sabbath. It's a sign between me and Bnei Israel forever. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and rested. But again, this Sabbath is one of those indicators that you want to be ruled by Him. But a lot of people will say, just say, keep a Sabbath. Why a particular Sabbath, or day of rest? And one thing we have to keep in mind, we don't think about it like this so much in America, but there are lots of belief systems around the world. There are a lot of gods around the world, aren't there? And all of these gods, all of them will pick their own holy days. All of them will pick their own festivals. They'll all have days that they call their people to worship. But the seventh day Sabbath is the one that He chose to set apart. He set the day. He made the appointment. But it also has to be said that just keeping the day, as part of this discussion described, keeping the day isn't enough. It must be combined with faith in whom, or in the one to whom Sabbath points, that rest and that reign of the Messiah. See, without Yeshua, it's not really rest. It's for we who have trusted are entering into the rest. He is the one who fulfills it. He is the one who brings it to its fullness. Rest is the rule and reign of the King. Again, we who have trusted enter into that rest. Then Hebrews 4:4 says, "For somewhere He has spoken about the seventh day." Again, this is why these things are tied. The Sabbath is tied to these things. And God rested on the seventh day from all His works. And again, in this passage, "They shall never enter my rest." So then it remains for some to enter into it. Yet those who formerly had good news proclaimed to them did not enter because of disobedience. Disobedience to the command of God, failure to trust God, is not going to ever give you rest. But the door to enter that rest, isn't it open? The door to enter that rest remains open for those who will believe. So even those that are kicking them out of the temple could still enter the rest if they believe. If they receive the one to whom the door is open. That's why He stands at the door and knocks. He's the one that can open any door, and the door that He opens, no one can shut. And He's also the one that, what He says, the door that He closes, no one can open. But the door to enter that rest remains open. And why would you? If you're already entering in through that door, into that rest, why would you ever consider walking out of the door? I thought about it like this, if you've entered the wedding feast, why would you ever leave? Or think about this, you're turning back or renouncing Yeshua, renouncing his Torah and his ways, now that he has revealed them to you, would be like something like a runaway bride. Upon seeing, you're coming down the aisle, and you see the best and perfect groom waiting for you, and instead you turn around and run out the door. Why would you do that? And then if you were to ask somebody who did something like that, and you hear them say, well, the reason why I left the groom at the altar was because one of the bridesmaids' dresses was kind of off color, and I didn't like that. Does that sound like a significant or a valid reason? Or what if they said, well, I was coming down and one of the audience members had a snotty look on their face, so I thought it was over. That's the kind of hard-heartedness that goes into these things. A hard heart refuses to live under the rule and reign of the king. So again, it remains for some to enter the rest, yet those who formerly had good news proclaimed to them did not enter because of disobedience, because they did not want to live under the rule of the king. And God appoints a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as it has been said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Do not harden your hearts. Some even in the days of the New Testament argue through this that Yeshua couldn't be the Messiah because the kingdom isn't here yet. It can't be today because all the things that today talks about haven't happened. Y'all heard that before? They were saying that even in their day. The rule of the king isn't here. The kingdom isn't here. The promises are not fulfilled. Therefore, Yeshua must be rejected. That was the argument, even in their day. But these same people, if you were to ask them, if Joshua was successful in fulfilling the role of leading the people into the promise, into the land, into the kingdom after Moses' death, they would say yes. They say that Joshua is the prophet like Moses, not Yeshua. I've heard that argument going on. They say that without realizing it, when they say these kind of things, without realizing it, they need to understand that not everything was fulfilled by Joshua either. Even though they would say, yes, Joshua was that guy. Not all the promises were fulfilled in Joshua's day. So how could he have been successful? How could Joshua be the prophet like unto Moses? And so if you're going to use that kind of standard to judge Joshua, then that also says something about the standard that they're using to judge Yeshua. Because the very next verse says this: for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. They thought Joshua had fulfilled these things. It was one of the criteria, or one of the reasons why they were accusing Yeshua as not being Messiah. But he said, look, God spoke of another day. So that means Joshua didn't do everything. So there remains a Shabbat rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered God's rest has also ceased from his own work, just as God did from his. And that was kind of a tricky statement, that verse 10. Because how did it describe us as believers, those who trust, a few verses earlier? So those who trust are entering into that rest, right? Like it was still an ongoing process. But here it says, the one who has entered, as in they're done. So who's the one who has entered into the rest? Yeshua has. He's the one who's already, he's manning the door. Right? He is the one who has finished from his own work. just as God did from his. And that's, Yeshua used that kind of language several times in some discussions, and it got him in trouble with some people because he said things like, I am working as my Father also is working, putting those things equal. But that's just kind of a little extra thing there. The promise of rest has not yet been completed, and it wasn't completed even by Joshua. No one has provided it, not even David provided it. The Sabbath rest remains to be seen and fulfilled, and only Messiah is going to be able to fulfill it. Only Messiah is going to be able to provide it. And until then, this world is going to go on and on and on, waiting for it. The priests of the temple and the sacrifices, they're still going to continue, so long as it's there. Because that doesn't bring in the rest either. The work of that will never end. But for those of us in Messiah, those who rest in him and his work, which is completed and ceased, we know that the promise of rest is coming, and so we are no longer living in fear. So we must go forward, waiting for the one Messiah who will fulfill and provide that rest for his people and not turn a hardened heart to him. Right? Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one may fall through the same pattern of disobedience. That's what he's talking to them about. That's what he's writing to them for. That they don't fall into that same pattern. He's like, guys, learn something from people who've already been through this and done this already. And don't do the same thing that they did. But it struck me in all of this about the Sabbath and the kingdom. How the Sabbath is a foretaste, this foretaste of glory divine that far too many are missing out on. It's a picture, and it represents the millennial kingdom, the millennial rule and reign of the king. That's what the Sabbath is supposed to be a picture of for us. How is it that we as God's people feel that it can be such a burden? How is it that people would not want to live under the perfect reign or the perfect king? See, that's that rebellion in us. That's that hard-heartedness in us. And if the Sabbath is a picture of the kingdom, this is where it gets a little interesting. If 1,000 years is as a day, right? We heard that construction before. Then what happens at the end of the 1,000-year reign can also reveal something about the end of our Sabbath day. You with me? If the Sabbath day is akin to the 1,000-year reign, then something that happens at the end of the 1,000-year reign also could maybe reveal something about the end of the Sabbath day. Especially about the state of our hearts and our acceptance of the rule of the king. Because at some point, the end of the 1,000 years comes, and then this happens. When the 1,000 years had ended, Satan shall be released from his prison, and he shall come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for the battle, and their number is like the sand of the sea. It's always kind of baffled me how this is possible. How Satan can be released, and there are people who have just experienced the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. I mean, is it ever going to get any better than that, right? As far as life here. They've just gone under that. But there are people who have experienced all of that who would prefer to be under Satan's rule rather than Messiah's. That is baffling. What is it? It's that hard heart that actually resents the ways of God and the ways that He would have us to live. And I have to confess that I am more like them than I would care to admit. Because I see it in myself as the Sabbath day comes to a close. And my thoughts start turning where? My thoughts start turning toward all the normal things of life that has to happen or that I want to happen after Sabbath is over. It's almost like we are waiting for our rest to be over so we can go back to doing our own things. And so without realizing it, we are anticipating going out of the door of our rest, anticipating leaving our groom at the altar, leaving the rule of our king, and living under another set of laws and another master's rule. And so when we are in such a hurry for the Sabbath to be over, and we are not acting and thinking are we not acting and thinking like those who will join Satan's rebellion when he is released at the end of the millennial kingdom? Are we not acting just like that? And that hurts. That got me this week. Should we not instead want his reign to last as long as possible? Because is there really anything better in this world? Do we want that we should let the Sabbath linger to savor it because it is a picture of our King. It's a picture of our time with him. That's essentially what the Havdalah is all about. You know, you don't do the Havdalah right at sunset, right? You have to do what? You're supposed to anyway. Wait. How long? Until you see the stars, right? Or 15, 20, 30 minutes. I mean, you don't know exactly how long it's supposed. It's sometime after that the Havdalah begins. And it's a picture of the lingering of the Sabbath, and almost a picture of mourning that the Sabbath is coming to an end. But it's also a statement of anticipation that the Sabbath is going to return. That's what it's saying. I don't want my time with the King to be over, but I am anticipating my time with the King coming back. Therefore, let us make every effort to enter that rest and not be so quick to exit. That's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we are here on Shabbat, is that this is the life that he wants for us, the life that is supposed to be with him. It is a day representing a day that belongs to him, where his rule and his reign governs our lives. And I know it's hard in the summer when the days are really long. Maybe you want to get something to eat. But let's not be so quick to want it to end.